بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Welcome back everyone to lesson 10. Hopefully, inshallah, in this lecture we will dedicate it entirely to the Battle of Uhud. We weren't able to really get into the details of Uhud in the last class, so we kind of got all the way up until right before the battle begins. So we're going to talk about the battles. Of course, this is a tragedy of sorts because there is mass confusion that ensues in the middle of battle, as indeed all battles are. They call it the fog of war. And there is the story of the archers disobeying the orders of the Prophet ﷺ, which subsequently causes the Muslims to be routed sort of towards the end of the battle. There are many moving stories. Of course, I don't have time to get into the details of them. Of course, this is just sort of an overview, so we're going to do that. We'll talk about the return on the 7th of Shawwal to Medina. It was Saturday, the 7th of Shawwal, the year 3 of the Hijrah. We'll talk about the death toll. And then we'll talk about what happens the next day, on the 8th of Shawwal. The Prophet ﷺ calls for battle only for those who fought in the Battle of Uhud. That will take us then to will take us into the fourth year of the Hijrah, of course, the fourth year of the Hijrah. So now, from now until the end, as I mentioned, we're going to try to follow the months and the years moving forward. And there were some skirmishes that took place in the first 3 months of that battle, and then we will try to culminate with the birth of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam that takes place on the 4th of Sha'ban. I don't think we'll get into the 5th year of the Hijrah, which is the Battle of the Ahzab, or the Battle of the Ditch. I don't think we'll get into that in this lecture. We'll have to unfortunately do that in the next lecture. But basically the same order. I'll narrate for you as much details as I think time permits in the Battle of Uhud, and then we'll talk about the consequences of that, and then the consequences not only of the immediate battle, but the following year's events are informed by what happens at the Battle of Uhud. So we'll talk about that inshallah. So that's the game plan, and if we can do more I will, but I don't think I can. We'll begin this discussion in the next clip inshallah. All right, so we're now at the Battle of let's talk a little bit about the Battle of Uhud. The archers who were placed on the mountaintop, they were able to repel the attacks of Khalid ibn Walid's cavalry 3 times throughout the battle. So they were successful. So from the point of view of the tactics, the Prophet ﷺ's tactic was correct, of course, and they had to protect the flank and the rear of the Muslim army, and they did that. So it served its cause. We talked about the flag of the Quraysh being lost and how that's sort of disastrous. And when the flag was lost of the Quraysh actually started to retreat. So when the Quraysh started to retreat, the Muslims on the battlefield are like, okay, we won. So they start to move forward to gather the spoils, to gather the things that were left behind. And there are the archers standing on the mountain seeing this. So in the archers' mind, they're like, we won, it's over, yay. And then they start to go down, which is a direct contradiction to the orders of the Prophet ﷺ. However, Abdullah ibn Jabir did not waver. He was reminding them of the orders of the Prophet ﷺ and that they had to stay. So about 40 of the 50 went down and the 10 remained. So the good news is not all of them remained. I think sometimes when we hear the stories growing up, these little details get lost and we assume that they all went down, but they didn't. It was just the 40 of the 50. Khalid ibn Walid, who radiallahu anhu at the time was not Muslim, but he was a genius, war genius, without doubt. I mean, there's no doubt about he was born for this. He saw, there's an opportunity, so he goes and he attacks the remaining 10 and they're all killed. So he kills the 10, the remaining, so now the flank is open. He just goes around and comes from the rear. And of course, if the Muslim army is like, we won, and then they start getting they're putting their weapons away, and then here comes this cavalry, not on foot, but the cavalry comes behind them. The Prophet ﷺ was behind all of this with 9 of his companions. He took his immediate instinct was to distract Khalid by saying, "Ya ibadallah," and of course, if Khalid hears that, and he sees the Prophet ﷺ by himself, basically unarmed. I mean, 9 people against a cavalry of a couple hundred. He said, "Okay, I can kill him. This can be over." So the Prophet ﷺ is putting a target on him. He's on himself. He's really, really putting himself at great risk. Some Muslims, when all of this started to happen, some of them fled to Medina. Others fled into the retreating Qurayshi army, and this is where the confusion really started to ensue. And then a third group, alhamdulillah, kept their heads and they went to the Prophet ﷺ to protect him. Right away, rumors started flooding the field of battle. There's no instant communication. So rumors started flooding that the Prophet ﷺ was killed. And of course, this is where even more confusion ensues. Some of the stories of bravery from this episode: Anas bin Nadar, he tried to stop the fleeing Muslims, and he said, even if the Prophet ﷺ has passed, fight for your faith. And he ran straight into the enemy to demonstrate that, and he fought until he was killed. When after the battle was over and they found his body, he had over 80 wounds, and only his sister could identify his body. I mean, he was so messed up from the wounds that he could not be identified except his sister. Thabit ibn Dahdah spoke to the Ansar, and he said, if the Prophet ﷺ is passed, Allah is alive and never dies, so fight. So there were these unwavering stances from those who are completely committed, and alhamdulillah, the whole thing, the Muslim army did not completely disintegrate. The Prophet ﷺ would yell, after he distracted Khalid, "Halumma ilayya ana Rasulullah," come to me, I am the messenger of Allah ﷺ. And the immediate, obviously, no one wants the Prophet ﷺ to die, so they immediately surround him, and between 7 and 9 of the companions die protecting him ﷺ. And then the Prophet ﷺ said, "Who will repel the enemy and be my companion in paradise?" So there were only at this point 2 left with the Prophet ﷺ: Talha ibn Ubaidullah and Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas radiallahu anhuma. This is when the Prophet ﷺ's right lower molar was injured and it fell in battle. There were heavy strikes against them. The Prophet ﷺ's face was bloody, and the Prophet ﷺ was trying to capture his blood so it would not touch the ground. And he said, "Allahumma ighfir li qawmi fa innahum la ya'lamun." Allah, please forgive for my people, they do not understand. Because if the Prophet ﷺ's blood would have touched the earth, the damnation from above would have come. So the Prophet ﷺ in the thick of battle is making dua for the enemy. Keep in mind when he says, "Allahumma ighfir li qawmi," Allah, forgive my people, he's referring to the Quraysh as his people. Sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So the Prophet ﷺ was encouraging Sa'd. He said, "My father and mother be a ransom for you." And the Prophet ﷺ never said that, both the father and mother, except in this moment to Sa'd radiallahu anhu. Talha was fighting so hard to protect the Prophet ﷺ that he lost one of his fingers. And later the Prophet ﷺ said, if you want to see a walking martyr, look at Talha. Later in history, when Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu would recall the events of Uhud, he would say, that day belongs to Talha. Right? He was the one that saved the Prophet ﷺ's life and saved the Muslims from complete disintegration. This is happening. Talha and Sa'd are protecting the Prophet ﷺ because those 7 to 9 people were killed. So it's literally 3 people, the Prophet ﷺ and these 2 Sahaba, against Khalid's army. Finally, quickly, when the Prophet ﷺ yelling, "Halumma ilayya," come to me, the rest of the companions that did not flee come to the protection of the Prophet ﷺ. There were those who had arrows in their backs, from guarding the Prophet ﷺ. There were those who had been hit 10 times. There were women who fought and were injured. Qatada lost his eye, and the Prophet ﷺ put it back in his eye, and he said, "I could see better from this eye than my other eye." After the defeat of this attack against the Prophet ﷺ, so they're able to successfully repel this initial attack against the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ marches forward with Ali carrying the flag. So the companions see him and realize that he's not dead, right? So the Prophet ﷺ, other than the fact that he has zero fear, he also is doing this as a show, I'm here. So people will rally against the Prophet ﷺ. So about 30 people start to gather, and At the base of the mountain of Uhud is the central camp of the Muslims. So the Prophet ﷺ with the flag and Ali, the people gather and then they slowly walk backwards. They slowly go back to the encampment. They tried to climb the mountain and attack, but Sa'd ibn Waqqas threw, meaning the Quraysh, but Sa'd ibn Waqqas threw 3 arrows under the Prophet's direction. He killed 3, so he was 100%, 3 for 3. And then upon seeing that, the Quraysh started to retreat. And then it said that Sa'd kept these arrows in the quiver until he died, saying they were a blessing. Now we have Abu Sufyan, the army's rallying around him, whoever's left from the Quraysh, and then on a peak of the mountain, the Prophet and the remaining Sahaba, and now they're going to banter back and forth. It's in my notes I said it's kind of like trash talk. I mean, the Prophet I'm not doing that, but the Quraysh are trash talking. And every time the Qurayshis would say something, the Prophet would tell Umar, respond, say something back, say something back. And then they agree that they're going to meet at Badr next year, right? So Abu Sufyan's we got you this time, and then there's this response, well, our Maw'idna at Badr, we'll see you next year at Badr. And that's how war was done. I mean, it was scheduled conflict. The Prophet sends Imam Ali alayhi salam to observe what are they doing, and he says they are riding the camels. So the Prophet understood that means khalas, they're going back to Mecca, because you're not going to ride a camel to battle, you ride a horse. He wanted to see, are they riding the camels, meaning they're heading back to Mecca, or are they riding the horses they're going to pounce on Medina? Because that was another threat. They could have just continued on to Medina. Alhamdulillah, they were heading to Mecca. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the deceased. The Prophet sent Zayd ibn Thabit to look for Sa'd ibn Rabi'a and to give him his salams. He found that he was wounded with over 70 strikes, and he said that he could smell paradise, and then he perished. There's also the story of Amr ibn Thabit, who became Muslim and fought without praying 1 rak'ah in Islam. So this was the famous story that he converted and entered the battle and died as a shaheed without even making wudu or praying. And then in this episode, this is like a small, very hard to find sometimes in the Sira books. Not hard, but it's a very small. Well, I'm running out of time. Let me pick this up in the next clip, inshallah. I ended by saying there's a small episode in the Battle of Uhud that sometimes we overlook, which is Muhayraq, who was a Jew. And, according to the stipulations of the constitution of Medina, if Medina is attacked or threatened, everybody has to raise an army. And of the Jews, only Muhayraq came. And the Prophet ﷺ praised him, and he said, he's the best of the Jews for fulfilling his oath and fighting for the homeland. The dead were buried, sometimes 2 or 3 to a grave because of the difficulties. Of course, the Prophet ﷺ was most saddened to see the body of Hamza alayhi salam, and the Prophet ﷺ buried them all. They prayed the janazah, and then they left. They returned to Medina on Saturday, the 7th of Shawwal, on the year 3 of the Hijrah. Himna bint Jahsh, she lost her brother, her maternal uncle Hamza, and then her husband, to which she started to cry profusely. So the companions were like, well, she lost all these people, why did she cry when she heard that she lost her husband? And the Prophet ﷺ says the husband of a woman causes her to cry. The relationship between a husband and wife is so intimate and so long that a bond grows that it's, may Allah Ta'ala protect us from such a calamity, but it's very hard. Yeah, it's very hard. It's like the loss of a child. Okay, the death toll. The Muslims lost 70. 65 from the Ansar, that's 41 from the Khazraj and 24 from the Aus. 4 from the Muhajirun, and 1 Jew at Muhayraq. So he is listed in the death toll of the people who fought in the Battle of Badr. And then Quraysh lost 37. So you see by the narration of the story, I mean, you would say it's a stalemate or something like that. But if we determine the victory and the defeat by the numbers, the casualties, this was a defeat. But alhamdulillah, because the Prophet ﷺ was able to repel, and the Sahaba were able to join him and then repel the rout of Medina, it's not a defeat. I mean, ultimate defeat would have been Abu Sufyan should have just continued to Medina and just captured it. But alhamdulillah, he didn't. So it's a defeat, but not really like a defeat. Okay, it's not like a defeat with a capital D, but it is a defeat nonetheless because of the body count. They returned to Medina on the 7th of Shawwal. The next day, on the 8th of the Shawwal, the Prophet ﷺ calls Medina to battle, and he says, only those who fought with me yesterday in Uhud will go out. The Prophet ﷺ rode out until Hamra al-Asad, which is about 80 kilometers from Medina. The Prophet ﷺ met Ma'bad ibn Abi Ma'bad al-Khuza'i, who had converted, and there the Prophet ﷺ was concerned about Quraysh, that they would turn to Medina. So he's still in his mind, though they're still there. I mean, it's not like they took a train and went back to, they can't be that far away. And it turned out that he was right, that they were preparing to attack Medina. When they arrived at Rawha, which is a 36, I said Hamra ibn al-Asad is 80 miles. I'm an American, so sometimes in my notes I use the empirical system, 80 miles. And then they arrived to Rawha, which is about 30 miles from Medina. They started to consider turning around, the Quraysh that is. The Quraysh, all throughout this episode, all these battles, they're not really united. So some of them wanted just to go back to Mecca, some of them wanted to go to Medina. Ma'bad encounters Abu Sufyan, the one that the Prophet ﷺ met. And he said, oh, the Prophet ﷺ is amassing this large army, right? So he starts to really scare him. So Abu Sufyan got scared and he turns around and goes to Mecca. So when the Prophet ﷺ went out the next day to meet Ma'bad, Ma'bad is telling him of what happened. The Prophet ﷺ stayed there from the 9th to the 11th of Shawwal. So they leave Medina on the 8th of Shawwal. They get to Hamra al-Asad. So he stays 9, 10, and 11, and then he returns to Medina. And then that, therefore, is the conclusion of the battle of Uhud. So, khalas, it's over. And the Prophet ﷺ, in that sense, you can think of it as a victory because he repelled the potential attack of Abu Sufyan. And that would have been pretty bad. I mean, if they were attacked the next day or within the first week after Uhud, who knows, Allahu A'lam, but Medina could have fallen. Now, the results of Uhud is that now everybody wanted a piece of Medina. The fact that Abu Sufyan was able to kind of inflict this type of damage, both casualty-wise and also reputation-wise, because this is also important. There were attacks in Dhul Hijjah of the third year from Banu Asad, an attack from Adal in the month of Safar in the fourth year, so now we're in the fourth year of Hijrah, an attack by Banu Amir in Safar, also in the fourth year of the Hijrah, and then finally Banu Nadir tried to kill the Prophet ﷺ in Rabi al-Awwal in the fourth year of the Hijrah, and Ghatafan tried to attack Medina in Jumad al-Awwal in the fourth year of the Hijrah. Now, opposite to what one would think, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 attacks in 4 months. So basically an attack a month, which at that time of history was a lot. That's a lot. For every 30 days for there to be an attack on your homeland, that's a lot. But this strengthened the Muslim morale, and their commitment to win was restored because they were able to repel these attacks. So even though Uhud, and again, when you do the super macro view of the Sira, Uhud is a defeat, and then we have the Battle of the Ditch. But there's all this important stuff that happens in between. So even though Uhud was a defeat, yes, statistically, it turned into a victory because now they were still able to repel Abu Sufyan's attack and then these other 5 attacks that happened shortly thereafter. So now let's talk about Muharram, the first of Muharram in the fourth year of the Hijrah. This was the excursion of Abi Salama. Now this is the Prophet ﷺ trying to exert military strength. This was 150 troops. There was intelligence that Banu Asad wanted to attack Medina, and Abu Salama's force caught them by surprise. All right, so we're going to go, these attacks that we heard were going to happen, we'll talk a little bit about how they were prevented. Then in the 5th of Muharram, in the 4th year of the Hijrah, we have Abdullah ibn Anis. This episode, there was intelligence that Khalid bin Sufyan al-Hudayli was preparing to attack. The Prophet ﷺ sent Abdullah ibn Anis, who went out for 18 days and nights, and then he returned with 7 days left in the month of Muharram, and he returned with the head of Khalid ibn Sufyan. The Prophet ﷺ gave him his cane and said, "This is a sign between me and you on the day of resurrection." Can you imagine being given the walking stick of the Prophet ﷺ? And when he died, he was buried with his cane, radiallahu anhu. It is permissible to be buried with artifacts, contrary to what some people think. And then there is the excursion of Ar-Raji that took place in Safar in the 4th year of the Hijrah. This was the tribe of Adal. Came and said they became Muslim and wanted someone to teach them. There are different narrations, 7 to 10 went with them. This military excursion, the leader of the Muslim was Marthad ibn Abi Marthad al-Ghanawi, and he traveled from Medina until he got to the area of Ar-Raji. They were ambushed and many of them were killed. Khabib was captured and imprisoned, and before they executed Khabib, he wanted to pray 2 rak'ahs, and he established the sunnah of praying 2 rak'ahs before you were going to be killed. Also, when he was captured and taken to Mecca, he miraculously was found grapes to eat in his, jail cell. But there are no grapes in Mecca, so this was one of the miracles of the Sahaba. This is the famous story that Abu Sufyan asked him, "Would you rather that the Prophet ﷺ was in your place?" And he said, "I wouldn't even want a thorn to prick the side of the Prophet ﷺ." The other one who survived this ambush was Zayd ibn Dathina. He was killed, and the Quraysh wanted to take his body to Mecca to be identified, but Allah Ta'ala caused a swarm of hornets to surround his body, and they didn't approach him. And this is because he had sworn that he did not want to ever be touched by a disbeliever, he didn't want to touch a disbeliever and did not want them to touch him. And when Umar heard the story, he said, "Allah protects the believer in life and death." We ask Allah Ta'ala to protect us in life and death. And next we have Bir Ma'una, which took place also in Safar of the year 4 of the Hijrah. This was led by, or the story is that Abu Barra Amr ibn Malik came to Medina. The Prophet ﷺ invited him to Islam, but he had like a lukewarm reaction. Abu Barra told the Prophet ﷺ to send his people to Najd to invite them to Islam under his protection. So the Prophet ﷺ sent 40 to 70 different narrations, Muslims under his protection. And then they encountered one of the enemies of Medina. Oh, I'm out of time. Let me pick up this exact where I stopped. I'll pick it up in the next clip. So we're talking about Bir Ma'una, the excursion that took place in Safar of the 4th year of the Hijrah. The Muslims went out with Abu Barra Amr ibn Malik, and then they encountered one of the enemies of Medina, who was Amr ibn Tufail, who killed one of them, and a battle ensued in which all but one companion were killed. So this is pretty disastrous. I want to see if some of the details I can skip over. Okay, unfortunately I cannot skip over these details. Another companion in this excursion, Amr ibn Umayyah, was traveling and he saw birds, indicating that bodies were there, and he found the Muslims being attacked. He went to their defense. He was captured but eventually released. When he was returning to Medina to inform the Prophet ﷺ, he found 2 men from the tribe of Banu Kilab, but they had safe passage from the Prophet ﷺ. But he was so upset that he killed one of them because of the justice that he thought was right. And when he informed the Prophet ﷺ, he had to collect the blood money from all of Medina to right this wrong. So the Prophet ﷺ had given these people that were non-Muslims safe passage. It's like a visa in our modern kind of nomenclature. And therefore you can't be harmed. They were unjustly harmed, so now he has to pay the blood money. And this is an important episode to understand the tensions between the Prophet ﷺ or the Muslims and Banu Nadir that will happen later in the Sira. Now, Banu Nadir is actually the next topic. So that takes place in Rabi al-Awwal in the 4th year of the Hijrah. The Jews of Medina were not fighters, but plotters. So they did not directly fight with the Prophet ﷺ and the people of Medina. But after Uhud, they openly started plotting with Quraysh against Medina. And this is really the beginning of the downfall of the Jewish tribes in Medina. When the Prophet ﷺ went to collect the money that we just talked about for Amr ibn Umayyah, to the blood money that he owed, they said, "Okay, just sit here by this wall, we'll go get the money for you and come back." And this is when they decided, great, we have him captured, we'll climb on top and we'll throw a rock and we'll kill him. Gabriel told the Prophet about this, and he was saved from this assassination. And then the Prophet said, okay, I'm going to give you 10 days to leave. You have 10 days and that's it, you're out. This is not going to work. You're not part of Medina anymore. Abdullah ibn Ubay convinced them to stay. Abdullah ibn Ubay, who we've been talking about since we got to Medina, convinced them to stay. So the Prophet laid siege to the city for 6 days. Abdullah bin Ubay actually left when he realized that he was going to lose. He kind of snuck out. At this point, Banu Nadir started to fear what was going to happen. The Prophet, they agreed to leave, but the Prophet said, you have to leave your swords and you have to leave your weapons. Most of them went to the Levant, some of them went to Khaybar, and 2 of them became Muslim. The Battle of Najd, this took place in Najd, in the eastern part of the Arabian Peninsula, Rabi al-Akhir or Jamad al-Awwal, the end of Rabi al-Akhir, the beginning of Jamad al-Awwal in the 4th year of the Hijrah. And then now we are in Sha'ban of the 4th year of Hijrah, so now we have a year has passed since Uhud. So this was Badr's 2. The Prophet went out with 1,500 troops. Abu Sufyan sent 2,000, but he got scared and turned around, and the Muslims stayed in Badr for 8 days. So in the battle sequences that we're talking about, you find a lot of this, and then the Muslims stayed. Because you have to make sure that the other person is retreating or left. You can't just pack up and leave. So there goes the promise from Uhud. It didn't happen. Sha'ban of this year, year 4, Imam al-Hussein was born, alayhi salam. And then, so I do have some time, I'm going to keep going. The Battle of Dum al-Jandal, Muslims stayed in Medina after Badr. Muslims returned from Badr to Medina, I meant to say, for 6 months. And then there were reports that the northern tribes were raiding the caravans and wanted to attack Medina. So the Prophet ﷺ sent 1,000 troops north. He went with them, actually, ﷺ. They left 5 days before the end of Rabi al-Awwal, in the 5th year of the Hijrah. When they were ready to attack, the enemy had completely dispersed. Okay, now let's look a little bit about some of the impacts of all of these activities, on the macro kind of political level. The Jews in Medina are now growing anxious. 2 major tribes have left, Qaynuqa and Nadir. What's left is, cat caught my tongue, I'm sorry, I apologize. Khaybar, sorry. Khaybar is left, but now they're really starting to worry because their plots are not working. Quraysh, Abu Sufyan is not able to conquer. The Muslims keep growing stronger. They're defending, but then they're also attacking potential threats. They show up, and then the enemy just disperses. That's not good from in the Medinese Jewish mindset. That's not good for their cause, which is to cause a rupture in the state of Medina. So 20 of them from Medina left quietly and went to Quraysh to see if they could work something out. And the real stinker is that Quraysh didn't show up for the Battle of Badr too, the promise. So they look bad. So this group of Jewish Medinese, they went to Ghatafan and the other tribes, trying to pitch them to create a coalition against Medina. And this is what's going to lead to the Battle of the Ditch or the Battle of the Ahzab. Abu Sufyan rides north with 4,000 from Quraysh. Other tribes also rode with Mecca. So now the amassed coalition against Medina is 10,000 strong. And this all starts from some of not all, but some of the Jews of Medina trying to rally this support against the Prophet ﷺ. Abu Sufyan and this coalition, there are 10,000. This is larger than the entire population of Medina. So this is, assured annihilation. This is assured destruction. There's no way that you can, if you count all the men, women, and children, all of them together are 10,000. So the Prophet ﷺ, this is happening, so he prepares, and he knew of the impending attack, so he calls for a war council. And it was at this council that the famous Sahabi Salman al-Farisi radiallahu anhu offers this stratagem. He's like, I have a solution. And this is where he talked about building a ditch. Nobody in Arabia had seen that or heard that or even thought of that. But coming from this rich, tradition of Persia, this, ancient civilization, I mean, there's a lot of wisdom, right? So we're open to good ideas. We're open to wisdom, right? The Prophet ﷺ said, awesome. Well, he did say awesome. He said, great, this is a great idea. We're going to do that. So then they start to construct the ditch. Medina at this time was protected, was well protected except for the northern border. This is where the Prophet ﷺ instructed them to build the ditch. So he got groups of 10 companions together, and they're all digging the ditch together. It took about 1,000 companions to do this. When all was said was done, the ditch was about 1 kilometer long, 6 meters wide, and 3 meters deep. This is for hand labor without any digging technology. This is intense. It took 4 to 6 days of continual work. There were no breaks, just shifts. About half of these days, they had no food. So it's dire. The situation is dire. The Prophet ﷺ was in the ditch with them. His chest, his blessed chest, ﷺ, was dusty, hammering away, encouraging them. They were, as I said, they were hungry. The Prophet ﷺ tied 2 stones around his stomach because of the hunger pains. And then at one point, in just a low point of like, okay, we need to eat or we're going to die, the Prophet ﷺ, there was a bowl of food. The Prophet ﷺ put his hands in it, and then the food, or the Prophet didn't put it, that was the water. The Prophet ﷺ took the bowl and started feeding the Sahaba. And the little bowl was enough to feed 1,000. This is one of the miracles of the Prophet ﷺ. And then I'll end with this one story, which is that there was a large stone that they couldn't break. So the Prophet ﷺ, okay, give me the hammer or whatever. And he starts to break it. He takes it, he swings it, and a big spark, and he says, Allahu Akbar. He does this a second time, a big spark, Allahu Akbar. He does it a third time. He sees this big spark, and the rock shatters, Allahu Akbar. So the Prophet, they asked him, like, what are you saying takbir for? What happened? He said, after the first one, he said, Allahu Akbar, I have been given the Levant. And then the second one, Allahu Akbar, I have been given Persia. And in the third one, Allahu Akbar, I've been given the keys of Yemen. He's talking about conquering all of these areas, but they're like hungry, dusty, and in the bottom of a ditch, right? So this is the vision of the Prophet ﷺ. I'll end with this story because it's a good story and we all know it, and then we'll pick up tomorrow to talk about the Battle of the Ditch. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah, in today's lecture we were able to go over the entirety of the Battle of Uhud, which is one of the tragic military excursions or battles of early Islam, in which we have the disobedience of the archers on the mountaintop of Uhud, who descended upon the initial victory of the Muslims. 40 of the 50 descended, 10 were remaining. Khalid ibn Walid saw the opportunity. He pounced upon the 10 archers, killed them, and then started to attack the Muslims from the rear. The Prophet ﷺ basically single-handedly deflected Khalid ibn Walid. The Sahaba see that that's happening, so they gather around him to protect the Prophet ﷺ. They're able to thwart this attack and kind of climb a little bit of the mountain. So now they're between them and the Quraysh is this mountain, and they banter back and forth, and they both go their own ways with the promise to meet next year in Badr. Of course, from a statistical point of view, the Muslims lost. But what ends up happening the next day and then the subsequent months is that the Prophet ﷺ and the Muslims are able to successfully repel all of the potential attacks on Medina. So they actually go out to these different regions, within 40, 50 miles of Medina, and they're either with little force or with no force able to repel potential attacks. And of course, one of those was that Abu Sufyan wanted to continue on to Medina, and the Prophet ﷺ and the Muslims were successful in repelling that attack. The next major kind of chunk is that of the Sira is that the Jews of Medina now are starting to become worried because the issue happened with Banu Nadir. They were forced to leave Medina because they would not pay for the blood money that one of the companions owed for killing a person that had safe passage. So after that, they felt, okay, well, we need to do something. So they start to gather a coalition of Meccan, the Quraysh, and other tribes against the Prophet ﷺ. This is what leads to the Battle of the Ditch. This is sort of in the middle of the discussion. We're in this middle of this discussion. And Abu Sufyan comes with 10,000 troops marching towards Medina. The Prophet ﷺ calls for a war council. Salman al-Farisi radiallahu anhu says, I have a solution. He offers them this idea of building a ditch around, or like a moat around Medina, which they do. And we're in the middle of this discussion of how the Prophet ﷺ was participating in that, and he broke this big stone, and he gave them the glad tidings that they will take the Persia, the Levant, and Yemen. And it's that we will pick up in the next clip, inshallah. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.